Welcome to part 2 of the book The Wild Robot. If you have not yet read or listened to part 1, which is chapters 1 through 39, please go and either read or listen to part 1 first. Part 2 will be chapters 40 through 80. Chapter 40, The Ship. Brightbill was a flying fanatic, and his favorite place to fly was up on the grassy ridge. The robot and the gosling liked to spend afternoons up there, working on the finer points of flying. And it was on one such afternoon that they noticed something mysterious far out at sea. Brightbill spiraled down to his mother, flopped onto the grass, and pointed to the horizon. "Mama, what is that thing?" Roz's computer brain found the right word. That is a ship. What's a ship? A ship is a large vessel used for ocean transport. Brightbill's face scrunched up with confusion. Used by who? I do not know. It was the first ship either of them had ever laid eyes on. From that distance, it looked as though it was moving slowly, but it was actually racing through the waves. From that distance, it looked as though it were small, but it was actually one of the largest ships ever built. The robot and the gosling watched it crawl across the ocean until it finally disappeared to the south. Where had the ship come from? Where was it going? Who was on board? Roz and Brightbill had many questions, but no answers. Chapter 41. The Summer. On clear summer days, Roz and Brightbill and Chit Chat liked to go exploring. They investigated the island's sandy southern point. They marveled at the rainbows that curved up from the waterfall. They surveyed the forest from the branches of tall trees. They met new friendly creatures, and sometimes they met new unfriendly creatures. But the only creatures they had to worry about were the bears. One time, they came upon a bear fishing in the river, and Roz whispered, "You know what to do." Brightbill flew up and away. Chit Chat scurried home through the treetops, and Roz melted into the landscape as only she could. Later, they met back at the nest and told the neighbors all about their brush with danger. On dreary summer days, they would stay inside. Roz asked Brightbill and Chit Chat about dreaming and about flying and about eating and about all the things they could do that she could not. But the youngsters had too much energy to sit still for very long. They spent one drizzly afternoon kicking acorns around the nest. Chit Chat piled them up, and then Brightbill swung his big foot and the acorns went flying. The little friends chased the acorns as they bounced and rolled and spun across the floor. Then they made a new pile and kicked them again. Sometimes an acorn would bounce off Roz's body, clang, and everyone would laugh and giggle together. Even Roz laughed. "Ha, ha, ha," said the robot, trying to act natural. On clear summer evenings, they would sit outside and watch fireflies twinkling around the pond. Then they'd lie back and gaze up at the darkening sky. "That big circle is the moon," said Chit Chat. "And those little lights are called stars, and one time I tried to count them all, but I can only count to 10, so I just kept counting to 10 over and over, and I have no idea how many stars there are, but I know it's more than 10. "They are not all stars," said Roz. "Some of them are planets." "What's a planet?" said Chit Chat. "A planet is a celestial body orbiting a star." "What does celestial mean?" "Celestial means something that is in outer space." "What's outer space?" "Outer space is the universe outside the atmosphere of our planet." "What's the universe?" "The universe is everything and everywhere." "Oh, so the universe is our island?" None of them would ever really understand the universe, including Roz. Her computer brain knew only so much. She could talk about the earth and the sun and the moon and the planets and a few stars and not much else. The night sky was full of streaking, shimmering, and blinking lights that she simply couldn't identify. Clearly, Roz was not designed to be an astronomer. On dreary summer evenings, Roz and Brightbill would curl up together, just the two of them, and listen to the rain pattering on the roof of the nest. The robot would tell stories of annoying pine cones and terrible storms and camouflaged insects. But the sound of rain always made Brightbill sleepy, and he'd be out before his mother could ever finish a story. Chapter 42. The Strange Family. It was a sweltering afternoon, and the heat had put everyone in a bad mood. Roz was standing in the shade, watching her son out on the water. The other goslings were teasing him about something when they suddenly burst into laughter, and Brightbill turned and hurried home with a stormy expression on his face. He stomped into the garden and right past his mother without saying a word. "What is wrong, Brightbill?" said Roz as she followed her son into the nest. "Nothing," he squeaked. "Leave me alone." "Tell me what is wrong." "I don't want to talk about it." "Maybe I can help." "Mama, the other goslings were making fun of me." "What did they say?" "They called you a monster and then laughed at me for having a monster mother." "They should know by now that I am not a monster. Would you like me to talk to them?" "No! Don't do that. That'll make things worse." The robot sat next to her son. "Mama, I know you're a robot, but I don't understand what a robot is." "A robot is a machine. I was not born. I was built." "Who built you?" "I do not know. I do not remember being built. My very first memory is waking up on the northern shore of this island." "Were you smaller back then?" said the gosling. "No, I have always been this size." Roz looked down at her weathered body. "However, I used to be shiny, like the surface of the pond. I used to stand straighter than a tree trunk. I used to speak a different language. I have not grown bigger, but I have changed very much." The robot wanted to explain things to her son, but the truth was that she understood very little about herself. It was a mystery how she had come to life on the rocky shore. It was a mystery why her computer brain knew certain things but not others. She tried to answer Brightbill's questions, but her answers only left him more confused. "What do you mean you're not alive?" squawked Brightbill. "It is true," said Roz. "I am not an animal. I do not eat or breathe. I am not alive." "You move and talk and think, Mama. You're definitely alive." It was impossible for such a young goose to understand technical things like computer brains and batteries and machines. The gosling was much better at understanding natural things like islands and forests and parents. Parents. The word suddenly left Brightbill feeling uneasy. "You're not my real mother, are you?" "There are many kinds of mothers," said the robot. "Some mothers spend their whole lives caring for their young. Some lay eggs and immediately abandon them. Some care for their offspring. Some care for the offspring of other mothers. I have tried to act like your mother, but no, I am not your birth mother." "Do you know what happened to my birth mother?" Roz told Brightbill about that fateful day in spring, about how the rocks had fallen and only one egg had survived, about how she'd put the egg in a nest and carried it away, about how she'd watched over the egg until a tiny gosling hatched. Brightbill listened carefully until she finished. "Should I stop calling you Mama?" said the gosling. "I will still act like your mother, no matter what you call me," said the robot. "I think I'll keep calling you Mama." "I think I will keep calling you son." "We're a strange family," said Brightbill with a little smile. "But I kind of like it that way." "Me too," said Roz. Chapter 43. The Gosling takes off. It must be hard to have a robot for a mother. I think the hardest part for Brightbill was all the mystery that surrounded Roz. Where had she come from? What was it like to be a robot? Would she always be there for him? These questions filled the Gosling's mind, and his feelings for his mother swung between love and confusion and anger. I'm sure many of you know what that's like. Roz could sense that Brightbill was struggling, and so she spent a lot of time talking with him about families and geese and robots. There are other robots on this island? Said the Gosling during one of their talks. He'd been sitting beside his mother in the garden, but now stood and faced her. Yes, there are others on the island, said Roz, but they are inoperative. Inoperative? For a robot, being inoperative is like being dead. Where are the dead robots? They are on the northern shore. I want to see them. I do not think that is a good idea. Why not? You are still a Gosling. You are too young to see dead robots. I will take you to see them when you are older. Mama, I'm not still a Gosling anymore. Brightbill puffed out his chest. I'm already 4 months old. I am sorry, said Roz, but you cannot go. Brightbill stomped around the garden and squawked, This isn't fair! I promise I will take you to see them when you are older, said the robot. But I want to go now! Please calm down. You can't even fly. I could take off and you wouldn't be able to stop me. Roz stood and her long shadow fell across her son. The Gosling could feel his emotions swinging wildly, and for a moment he was actually afraid of his own mother. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the pond, beat his wings, and flew away. Chapter 44, The Runaway. Your son will be fine, said Loudwing. You know how they are at this age. I do not know, said Roz. Please tell me how they are at this age. Oh, right. Well, Brightbill is growing up fast. It's only natural for adolescent goslings to be a little moody. He just needs to be alone for a while. You've raised a wonderful son. I know he'll come home soon. Try not to worry. But Roz did worry. At least she worried as much as a robot is capable of worrying. Brightbill had never run away or flown away, and suddenly Roz was computing all the things that could go wrong. A violent storm, a broken wing, a predator. She had to find her son before something bad happened. There was only one place Brightbill could have gone, the robot gravesite. So Roz galloped northward. She leaped over rocks and ducked under branches and charged through meadows without ever slowing her pace. She raced all the way across the island until she finally stepped onto the sea cliffs above the gravesite. And there was Brightbill, perched on the edge, looking at the robot parts scattered on the shore below. His eyes were wet. Don't be angry, he said to his mother as his mother walked over. I am not angry, but you should not have flown off like that. You could have gotten hurt, or worse. I was worried sick. I'm sorry, Mama. It is okay, said Roz. It is only natural for goslings your age to be a little moody. Mama, I need to understand what you are, and I think it might help to see those other robots. You are right. It might help. Why are you not down there? I was about to go, said Brightbill, but I got nervous. I want you to go with me. Let us go down there, said Roz. Together. Chapter 45, The Dead Robots. The Gosling floated on the breeze beside his mother as she climbed down the cliffside. Down they went, past ledges and seagulls and tough little trees, until they were standing on the rocky shore with the cliffs looming behind them. The gravesite had changed. Roz's crate was gone, lost to weather or waves. Some of the robot parts were gone too. Other parts were gritty with sand or were tangled in seaweed or were inhabited by small, scuttling creatures. One smashed torso still had a head and legs attached. Roz and Brightbill huddled around the corpse and studied the mess of tubes spilling out. "This thing used to look like you?" said Brightbill. "Yes, we are the same type of robot," said Roz. "And now this robot is dead?" "In a way." "Will you ever die, Mama?" "Will I die?" I think so." "Will I die?" "All living things die eventually." The gosling's face scrunched with worry. "Brightbill, you are going to live a long and happy life." Roz laid a hand on her son's back. "You should not worry about death." The gosling's face relaxed, and then he pointed to a small, round shape on the back of the dead robot's head. "What's that?" he said. Roz leaned in closer. "That is a button, which is a knob or a piece of machinery that can be pressed to operate it." Brightbill began pressing the button. Click, click, click. "Nothing is happening," he said. "Probably because this robot is dead." Click, click, click. "Mama, do you have a button?" Brightbill watched as his mother's head turned all the way around and a small button came into view. "You've got one," he said. "I never noticed it before." "Neither did I," said the robot. The gosling giggled. "Oh, Mama, you have so much to learn about yourself." Roz reached for the button on her head, but her hand automatically stopped before she could touch it. She tried with her other hand, but it automatically stopped as well. "It seemed I cannot press the button," she said. "Would you like to try?" "What will happen?" "I think that I will shut down, but I think you could simply press the button again to restart me." "You think?" squawked Brightbill. "What if you're wrong? What if you wake up different? What if you never wake up? Mama, I don't want to shut you down." Roz turned her head back around and saw that Brightbill's face was once again scrunched with worry. She knelt beside him and said, "Of course you do not have to shut me down. I'm sorry if I scared you. Are you okay?" "I'm okay." Brightbill sniffled and wiped his eyes, and then he heard splashing. Otters were playing in the ocean. He had never seen otters before. He stared as they swam and dove and sloshed around with one another. They seemed to be having a ridiculous amount of fun, and suddenly the gosling was smiling again. "Hello, my name is Brightbill," he shouted over the waves, "and this is my mama. Her name is Roz." The last time those otters had seen Roz, they had thought she was some kind of monster. But since then, they'd heard that she was remarkably friendly, and that she'd even adopted an orphaned gosling. And so the otters smiled at Roz and Brightbill. Then they swam straight over and splashed onto the rocks. "Hello there," said the biggest otter. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you both. Actually, Roz, we've met once before, but you might not remember me. My name's Shelley." "I do remember you," said the robot, "but I am glad to learn your name, Shelley." "You know each other?" said the gosling. "These otters were the first animals I ever met," said Roz. "They were also the first animals who ever ran away from me." "Yeah, sorry about that," said Shelley, as the other otters sniffed the robot's legs. "You know, Brightbill, when we first saw your mom, she was packed in a box and surrounded by soft, squishy stuff." Brightbill's brow furrowed. "You wouldn't believe how small she looked, all folded up in there." Brightbill's nose sniffled. "We thought she was dead, but when we reached into the box, she came to life, and climbed out looking like a sparkling monster. Brightbill's eyes were welled up with tears, and then he felt his mother scoop him into her arms. "Are you okay?" she whispered into his ear. "I think I've learned enough about robots for today," he whispered back. "I am sorry, Otters," said Roz, "but we really must be going." "I hope I didn't upset the little guy," said Shelley. "I thought he'd like to hear how we first met." "Brightbill will be fine," said Roz, using a friendly voice. "But we have had a very busy day, and we should go home. It was nice to see you again. Goodbye." Roz turned, and with her long strides, she carried her son away from the gravesite and over to the base of the sea cliffs. "Would you like to sit on my shoulder as I climb?" said the robot. "I feel like flying," said the gosling. "I'll meet you at the top." Brightbill flapped his wings and disappeared into the sky. Roz began scaling the wall. Up she went, expertly negotiating rocks, columns, and ledges until she hoisted herself onto the cliff top, where 2 young bears were waiting. Chapter 46. The Fight. "Hello, bears. My name is Roz." "Oh, we know who you are," said the sister bear. Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "We're very happy to see you again." "Yeah, we're very happy to see you again," echoed the brother bear. "Why do you always repeat what I say?" said the sister bear to her brother. "It's so annoying." "I was just backing you up. Let me do the talking. Fine. I don't have to be so mean. You don't have to be so mean about it." The bickering bears were interrupted by the robot's friendliest voice. "With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" "How rude of us," said the sister bear. "My name is Nettle, and this is my little brother Thorn." "I'm not little," snapped Thorn under his breath. "It is lovely to meet you both," said Roz, "but I'm afraid I really must be going." "And I'm afraid we can't let you do that." Nettle stepped into Roz's path. "My brother and we don't like monsters." "I am not a monster. I am a robot." "Whatever you are, we don't like you," said Thorn. "We hear you've become very comfortable on our island," said Nettle. "Now we're going to make you very uncomfortable." "Yeah, we're going to make you very uncomfortable." "Stop repeating me, Thorn." Poor Roz was in serious trouble. The bears were closing in on her, and she couldn't run, she couldn't hide, and she couldn't fight. The robot didn't know what to do, but before she could do anything, there was a loud squawk and a streak of feathers. "Stay away from my mama!" Brightbill swooped down and skidded to a stop between the robot and the bears. "So the rumors are true," Nettle laughed. "There really is a runty gosling who thinks the robot is his mother. How could anyone be so stupid? Do yourself a favor, gosling, and fly away before you get hurt." "She is right, Brightbill," said Roz. "Please let me handle this." But the gosling stood his ground. He spread his wings and hopped around, ready to defend his mother. The bears roared with laughter. Then, with a flick of her paw, Nettle sent Brightbill tumbling over the ground, over and over, until he flopped onto his back and stared up at the sky, stunned. "This is our island," snarled Nettle. "And it's time for you to go," growled Thorn. Roz made herself as big as possible. She banged her chest and roared wild, angry sounds, but the bears were not intimidated. They roared right back, and then they attacked. Nettle pulled Roz into a fierce bear hug while Thorn clawed at her legs. The robot tried to shake free, but the bears would not let go of their prey, not this time. A cloud of dust bloomed around the trio as they thrashed closer to the edge of the cliff. All of a sudden, something burst out from the trees and onto the open cliff top. Mother Bear. She was gigantic, like a mountain of golden fur, and she was furious. It seemed like this would be the end for our robot. But Mother Bear wasn't there to join the fight. She was there to break it up. "Nettle! Thorn! Get over here this instant!" The young bears should have listened to their mother. Instead, they pretended not to hear her. Nettle slashed at Roz's body, and Thorn began wrestling with her foot. He grabbed the foot with both paws and forced it up from the ground. Then, with every ounce of his strength, he twisted the foot around. Reader, the following events happened very quickly. First, there was a strange thwip sound as the robot's right foot popped off her leg and sailed through the air. Then, everyone toppled over. Nettle and Roz fell sideways along the edge, but Thorn fell backward and tumbled right off the cliff. Do you know what the most terrible sound in the world is? It's the howl of a mother bear as she watches her cub tumble off a cliff. Mother Bear's howl was so startling that it snapped Brightbill right out of his stupor. Her howl was so powerful that it shook Roz's entire body. Her howl was so loud that the animals heard it clear across the island. But there was no reply from Thorn. Mother Bear's howl slowly faded, and she wilted to the ground. Roz watched as her detached foot sailed over the edge and plummeted down to the shore below. It fell past circling seagulls, smashed off a rock, and disappeared into the waves. And that's when the robot noticed something furry dangling from the cliffside. Thorn! His full weight hung from a tree that was rooted to the rock wall. He gripped the tree tightly in his jaws and looked up at Roz with wide, frightened eyes. "I see Thorn!" shouted Roz. "Grab my legs, quickly!" Mother Bear and Nettle scrambled to their feet. Each bear took a leg in their mouth, and together they slowly lowered Roz head first down the cliff. Thorn whimpered through clenched teeth as he watched the robot approach. Then he felt her strong arms wrap around him, and he heard her booming voice holler, "Pull us up!" Thorn let go of the branch and cried, "Please don't drop me, Roz. I don't want to die." "Do not worry," said the robot. "I will not drop you." The next few moments seemed to drag on and on. Mother Bear and Nettle kept pulling on Roz's legs, and more of the robot slowly came into view until a furry golden head finally appeared, and Thorn leaped into the embrace of his family. Chapter 47. The Parade. "Does it hurt?" Brightbill touched the smooth surface where his mother's foot used to be. "No, it does not hurt," said Roz, "but it will be difficult for me to walk." The bears huddled behind the gosling and stared at the robot's stump of a leg. Nobody understood how a foot could pop off like that, or how Roz could remain calm. "Roz, I'm sorry my cubs attacked you," said Mother Bear. "Sometimes they're completely out of control." "It is okay. You know how they are at this age." "I cannot thank you enough for saving Thorn. I promise my cubs will never bother you again. Isn't that right?" "Yes, Mother," said Nettle and Thorn together. The robot tried to walk. She bobbed up and down on her uneven legs, which worked well enough on the flat surface of the cliff top, but once she entered the forest, her problem became clear. The smooth stump had no grip, and it slipped around the forest floor. So Roz tried hopping on her one foot. She took a few crunching hops and then clanged into a tree trunk. A few more hops and she crashed into the undergrowth. "I'm really sorry I broke off your foot," said Thorn as he helped the robot up from the weeds. "I forgive you," said Roz. Whether she was capable of true forgiveness is anyone's guess. But they were nice words, and Thorn felt better when he heard them. "It looks like I will have to crawl home," said Roz. Nonsense, said Mother Bear. I have a better idea. Mother Bear lay flat on the ground while her cubs boosted Roz onto her back. Then Bright Bill fluttered onto the bear's broad shoulders, and when they were both safely aboard, the group set off through the forest. The robot was heavy, but she was no trouble for the giant animal. Mother Bear strolled along as if it were perfectly normal for a robot to be riding on her back. They made quite a grand procession, all walking together like that, and the procession became even grander as deer and raccoon and birds and all kinds of other animals joined in. Everyone wanted to see the mother robot riding the mother bear. The group wound its way past ancient trees and over rolling meadows and through babbling streams, collecting more and more curious animals as they went. It was the grandest parade of wildlife anyone had ever seen, and leading the way was our robot, Roz. But the parade couldn't last forever. As the sun went down, the other animals began drifting away, one by one, and when the parade finally arrived at the nest, only the original members remained. Here we are, said Mother Bear, helping Roz down into the garden. Now wasn't that better than crawling all the way home? Oh yes, that was wonderful, said the robot. I cannot imagine a better ending to this day. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was amazing, squeaked the gosling. My friends won't believe me when I tell them I rode across the island on the back of a bear. I'm glad you enjoyed yourselves, Mother Bear smiled. It's the least I could do after all the trouble these two caused. Her smile became a frown as she glared at her cubs, who suddenly took great interest in a pebble on the ground. It was late, and it had been a long, difficult day for everyone. So the bears said goodbye and headed back to their cave. Bright Bill and Roz stood in the garden and watched their new friends lumber away. And then the gosling said, Mama, do you think you'll ever walk again? I am not sure, said the robot, but I know who to ask for help. Now go get ready for bed. Chapter 48. The New Foot. Mr. Beaver squinted at Roz's stump. I've never built a foot before. He stroked his whiskers and muttered to himself, There are really 3 problems to solve. The foot needs to grip the ground, and it needs to be durable, and then there's the issue of fixing it to the leg. I might have to consult a few friends. Will she ever walk again? Said Bright Bill. What's that? Mr. Beaver was lost in thought. Oh, not to worry. You just sit back and leave everything to me. I love a challenge. Mr. Beaver plunked into the pond and returned a while later rolling a large section of tree trunk. Say hello to your new foot, he said, slapping the wood with his tail. Hello, new foot, said the robot. That's the spirit. This beauty is from one of the hardest trees I ever chewed. I just need to make a few modifications. Mr. Beaver placed the piece of wood next to Roz. He squinted, repositioning the piece, and squinted some more. With his claws, he marked different spots on the wood, and then he put his big chompers to work. The beaver chewed and gnawed and carved up that piece of wood, turning it over and over in his paws. Chit-Chat looked down from a branch and chattered through the quiet moments. This reminds me of the time I saw a fox catch a lizard by the tail, and somehow the lizard's tail fell off and he got away, and later I saw the lizard got a new tail, and now Roz is going to get a new foot and everything will be fine. The wooden foot took shape, and before long Mr. Beaver was standing beside a beautiful carving that resembled a boot. He tried to slide it over Roz's stump, but the opening was too small, so he scraped out more wood until it was a perfect fit. Very good, he said, spitting out a wood chip. My friends should be arriving any minute with the next few things we'll need. And there they are now. I'd like you all to meet Bumpkin, Lumpkin, and Rumpkin, but I call them the Fuzzy Bandits. 3 fat raccoons shuffled into the garden, dragging a tangle of vines behind them. Good day, said Bumpkin. "Good day," said Lumpkin. "Good day," said Rumpkin. You might already know this, reader, but raccoons have very nimble hands, and the Fuzzy Bandits used theirs to skillfully tie those vines around the robot's leg and around her new foot. The vines caught nicely on all the dings and dents and scrapes. Once they were tied good and tight, Mr. Beaver threw back his head and hollered, "Trunk Tap, we could use your assistance." There was silence, and then 3 quick taps echoed down from the forest canopy. "Ah, that'll be him," said Mr. Beaver, smiling. A very handsome woodpecker swooped into the garden. "You called?" came the woodpecker's musical voice. "Indeed I did. Everyone, this is my woodpecking pal, Trunk Tap. Now, Trunky, we need some tree resin, the really sticky stuff. Can you help us out?" "Of course I can," said the woodpecker. "You've got a perfect pine right here." Trunk Tap hopped over a crusty old pine tree and pecked a few deep holes in the bark. Thick, syrupy resin began oozing down the trunk. Mr. Beaver scooped up handfuls of the resin and smeared it all over the wooden foot and the vines until everything was glistening with stickiness. And when the resin dried a short time later, Roz's foot was finished. "This is wonderful," said the robot as she strolled around her garden. "I am as good as new." Mr. Beaver and Trunk Tap and the Fuzzy Bandits went away feeling pretty happy with themselves. They'd done a very nice thing. But it was the first wooden foot any of them had ever made, and within a week the vines were coming undone and the foot was sliding loose. So they returned, determined to get it right. They found even harder wood and even tougher vines. They experimented with resin, heating it by the fire, letting it boil and thicken until it became an indestructible glue. They kept tinkering with their design until finally Roz had herself a wooden foot that she could rely on. "Huzzah!" Mr. Beaver rapped his knuckles on the new and improved creation. "I knew we'd get it right." Roz moved slower than before, and she had a slight limp, but she was back to her old self again, and that was a relief to everyone, especially Bright Bill. Chapter 49. The Flyer. With coaching from his mother, Bright Bill was becoming a truly exceptional flyer. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was the smartest. You see, he and his mother had started studying the flying techniques of other birds. They'd sit for hours and watch how hawks and owls and sparrows and vultures moved through the air. Then they'd go up to the grassy ridge and Bright Bill would practice what he'd learned. Soon he was diving and swooping and darting and soaring around the island. The adult geese frowned at his flying tricks, but the goslings thought he was amazing. Each morning a gaggle of them would wait on the water for Bright Bill to lead them into the sky, and then, a few hours later, he'd return home to Roz, shaking his tail feathers and honking about his latest airborne adventures. "Mama, the other goslings didn't know that warm air rises, so I found an updraft and we spent the afternoon circling around and hardly flapping our wings at all. Mama, did you see that lightning storm today? We knew there was trouble when the wind started blowing from the north, so we flew down to some shrubs and waited for the storm to pass. Mama, we just tried to fly in formation. We all took turns at the point, but everyone liked following me best, so I led most of the time." Chapter 50. The Button. Bright Bill was thinking about the small button on the back of his mother's head. His mother was thinking about it too. They couldn't stop wondering what would happen if the button were pressed, and one day they decided it was time to find out. Roz sat on the floor of the nest. Her son nervously stood on a stone behind her. "I am ready when you are," said the robot. "Okay," said the gosling. "Here we go." Bright Bill took a deep breath. Click. Roz's body relaxed. Her quiet whirling slowly stopped. Her eyes faded to black. Mama, can you hear me? There was no answer. Brightbill waddled around and looked at his mother's face. Her strange spark of life had gone out. The gosling had never felt more alone. He was ready to switch her back on. But what if she didn't wake up? What if she woke up different? The gosling was afraid to press the button, and he was afraid not to press the button. Brightbill took a deep breath. Click! Roz's body tensed. Her quiet whirling slowly started. Her eyes began to glow. Mama, can you hear me? Hello, I am Rozum, Unit 7134, but you can call me Roz. The robot spoke these words automatically, in a language Brightbill didn't understand. His little heart raced as his worst fears seemed to be coming true. But a moment later, her familiar voice returned, and the robot said in the language of the animals, Hello, son. How long was I out? It seemed like only an instant to me. You were out for a few minutes, said the gosling, as he hugged his mother, but it seemed like forever to me. Chapter 51. The Autumn. The days were getting shorter, the air was getting crisper, and one morning Roz walked out to find a layer of frost on the garden. Autumn had come to the island. The tree leaves, which had been green for the robot's entire life, turned yellow and orange and red. Then they let go of their branches and floated down to the ground, and the forest gradually filled with the sounds of creatures scurrying through dead leaves. Tree nuts were also falling, thunking onto roots and rocks and occasionally clanging off the robot. The smell of flowers faded as blossoms withered. All the rich scents and colors of the island were draining away. The animals were also changing. Furry animals were growing more fur. Feathery animals were growing more feathers. Scaly animals were starting to look for new homes. Yerp, it's cooling off, croaked one frog to another. Before long, it'll be time for sleeping. Yerp, I'd better start looking for a good hole, croaked the second frog. Have you found one yet? Nah, croaked the first frog. I'll look for a hole next week. For now, I'm going to enjoy the warm sunlight while it lasts. Yerp. Many of the island animals were already thinking about their winter hibernation. Frogs, bees, snakes, and even bears would soon disappear and spend the next few months resting out of sight. And then there were the birds. Some birds, like owls and woodpeckers, would spend the winter nesting and eating the island's few remaining edibles. But the migratory birds were preparing for the long journey south to their warm wintering grounds. And among the birds destined to leave were the geese. Chapter 52. The Flock. Brightbill slowly waddled into the nest. He had a confused look on his face. Mama, the other goslings said that we have to leave the island soon, and we won't return for months and months. Is that true? That is true, said Roz. You know that geese migrate south for the winter. Will you migrate with us? Said Brightbill. I cannot fly or swim, so I will spend the winter here on the island. Can I stay with you? I do not think that is a good idea. I think you should migrate with the flock. How long will the migration take? Said Brightbill. Where will I fly? When will we come home? I do not know, said Roz. Let us go ask the others. And so the robot and the gosling walked around the pond to where Loudwing and her friends were chatting. Hello, everyone, said Roz. Brightbill has some questions about the flock's upcoming winter migration. And we'd be happy to answer them, said Loudwing. What would you like to know, little one? How long will the migration take? Said Brightbill. Where will we fly? When will we come home? It'll take us a couple of weeks to fly south, said Loudwing, depending on the weather. We'll join other flocks at a beautiful lake in the middle of a great sprawling field, said another goose. And we'll come back to the island after 4 or 5 months, said someone else, depending on the weather. As they walked back to the nest, Brightbill said to his mother, Lately I've been feeling this strong urge to fly, not just around the pond or the island, but to go on a long flight, a journey. Those are your instincts, said the robot. All animals have instincts. They help you survive. Do you have instincts? Said the gosling. I do have instincts. They help me survive, also. My instincts are definitely telling me to fly south for the winter, said Brightbill. I just wish you could join us. I'm going to worry about you while I'm away. Do not worry. I will be fine, said Roz. How bad could winter be? Chapter 53. The Migration. It was the night before the migration, and Brightbill was sleeping fitfully. Roz watched him toss and turn until he finally crawled up into her arms, and she rocked him to sleep, just like the old days. Early the next morning, Brightbill waddled outside and looked at the pond. The water was perfectly still. A few lazy clouds drifted above. Geese were already gathering by the beach. And then tiny Claus scampered down from the treetops. So today's the day, huh? Said Chit Chat, perched on a branch. You're going to see so many new things and meet so many new animals, and if there are any squirrels at your wintering grounds, please tell them that Chit Chat says hello. Today is the day, said Brightbill. The flock will be leaving soon. Are you excited or nervous or scared? I'm all of those things. The squirrel whispered, Well, don't worry about your mother. I'll look after her, so you know she'll be perfectly fine. Brightbill smiled. I'm afraid it is time to go, said Roz as she stepped out of the nest. Okay, Mama, said the gosling. See you in the spring, Chit Chat. Have a nice migration, Brightbill. The squirrel scampered back into the treetops. Come home with lots of exciting stories, but not too exciting because I don't want anything scary to happen to you. Goodbye. The geese were honking with excitement and hustling around as they made their final preparations. Several of the fathers huddled together discussing their flight plans, while the mothers took a head count. There you are, Brightbill, Loudwing honked from the middle of the crowd. We're just about to begin. May I have your attention, please, said the biggest goose. As most of you know, my name is Longneck, and I'll be leading this year's migration. I'm asking everyone to please join your families for takeoff. Once we're all airborne, each family will take its position in our V formation, and we'll start the first leg of our journey. Are there any questions? I have a question, came a booming voice. My son will not have any family with him. Where does he fit into the formation? Everyone turned to Longneck. He can fly with me, said the big goose. I hear Brightbill is a very clever flyer. I could use his help at the point. A moment later, the geese began flapping and honking and making their way into the air. A cloud of feathers floated down around the robot and her son. You are not a gosling anymore, said Roz. I am proud of the fine young goose you have become. Brightbill fluttered up into his mother's shoulder. Thanks, Mama. The young goose wiped his eyes. Is this where we say goodbye? This is where we say goodbye for now. Spring will soon be here, and we will be together again. I'm going to miss you, said Brightbill as he nuzzled his mother. I'm going to miss you too, said Roz as she nuzzled her son. The goose took a deep breath. Then he shook his tail feathers, flapped his wings, and joined the flock. At first, the geese flew in a disorganized jumble, but each goose slowly drifted into position until the flock formed a wobbly V. At the lead was Longneck, and behind his left wing was Brightbill. They circled in the sky until the V pointed south, and then the geese began their long migration. Roz climbed to the top of a tree and watched as the flock slowly faded into the horizon. Chapter 54. The Winter. The island was quiet. The migratory birds had all left. The hibernators were asleep, and everyone else had begun their simple winter routines. Everyone but Roz. Now that she was alone, our robot didn't know what to do with herself. She stood in her gray garden and watched a sheet of ice slowly form on the pond. Sometimes she could hear her good friends, the beavers, going about their business beneath the ice, and she wondered when she would see them again. Roz stood there until snowflakes started drifting down from the sky. The flakes swirled in the breeze and slowly piled up on the ground and on the trees and on the robot. So she crouched into the nest, slid the stone door behind her, and sat in darkness. Hours and days and weeks went by without the robot moving. She had no need to move. She felt perfectly safe in the nest. And so, in her own way, the robot hibernated. Roz's body relaxed. Her quiet whirring sound slowly stopped. Her eyes faded to black. She probably could have spent centuries like that, hibernating in total darkness. But the robot's hibernation was suddenly interrupted when a shaft of sunlight fell upon her face and carried energy back to her empty battery. Roz's body tensed. Her quiet whirring sound slowly started. Her eyes began glowing. "Hello, I am Rozum, Unit 7134, but you may call me Roz," the robot said automatically. When all her systems were up and running again, Roz noticed that she was surrounded by broken branches and piles of snow. The roof of the nest had caved in, and the lodge was now flooded with sunlight. Roz felt more energized with each passing minute, but she also felt cold. Her joints felt stiff and brittle, and her thinking was slow. So she got up, cleared a spot on the floor, and made a fire. The snow inside the nest began to melt, and the robot's sensors began to thaw. And when she was ready, she climbed out through the hole in the roof and into a bright, foreign landscape. The world Roz had known was now covered in a thick layer of snow. Tree limbs bent to the ground under heavy sleeves. The dark pond was now pure white. The only sounds were Roz's own crunching footsteps. Faint wisps of steam curled up from the robot's body as she trudged through the forest. Roz plunged a hand into a lump of snow and pulled up a long stick. She snapped it in half and flung both pieces back to the nest. She took a few more steps and picked up a fallen tree. She hacked it into smaller pieces and flung them back as well. Then she reached down to another snowy shape, but what she pulled up was not a piece of wood. It was Dart, the weasel. He was frozen solid. Roz stared at his stiff body for a moment, and then decided it was best to leave the poor thing where he was. As the robot continued gathering wood, she found more victims of the cold. A frozen mouse, a frozen bird, a frozen deer. Had all the island animals frozen to death? No, not all. There were a few fresh tracks in the snow. As we know, the wilderness is filled with beauty, but it's also filled with ugliness. And that winter was ugly. A devastating cold front had swept down from the north and brought dangerous temperatures and huge amounts of snow. The animals had prepared for winter, but nothing could have prepared the weaker ones for those long nights when the temperatures plummeted and the wind whipped over the island. Roz returned to the nest where the fire had melted the interior snow to a muddy soup. She took a minute to warm her body by the flames, and then she began the repairs. She patched up the hole in the dome with a lattice work of branches before adding a layer of mud and leaves, and soon the repairs were complete. But another snowfall might cave in the nest all over again, so Roz decided to keep a fire going day and night to prevent snow from building up on the roof. The robot brought in load after load of firewood, and each time she went outside, she was reminded of the frozen weasel and mouse and bird and deer. How many other frozen animals were hidden beneath the snow? Before going in for the night, she called out to whoever was listening. "Animals of the island, you do not have to freeze. Join me in my lodge where it is safe and warm." Chapter 55. The Lodgers. Firelight spilled out from the nest and into the cold, blustery night. Roz sat inside and listened to the wind and to the soft pops and crackles of burning wood. And then the robot's keen hearing picked up another sound, tiny footsteps crunching through the snow. "Roz, I'm freezing. Can I join you by the fire, please?" said a weak voice. Into the light crawled Chit Chat. The squirrel was shivering, and clumps of ice stuck to her fur. When she finally felt the heat of the fire, she collapsed. Roz picked her up off the floor, gently placed her on a warm stone, and let her sleep. An hour later, there were more footsteps, and a family of hares shuffled into the nest. They huddled together in a corner without saying a word. Pinktail the possum was the next to arrive. "Good evening," she mumbled, trying to act cheerful. "It certainly has been chilly." Swooper the owl hobbled in, followed by some chickadees and a magpie. Fink knew a good thing when he saw it, and the fox lay right by the fire. Then came Digdown the groundhog. The fuzzy bandits carried in an old turtle named Crag, who was in the worst shape of all. Creatures who should have been hibernating deep underground had been roused by the vicious weather. Only the healthiest animals with the warmest homes were safe. More and more weary animals appeared, and slowly the lodge filled up. This was the first time many of the lodgers had seen fire, and they gazed at it with a mixture of fear and hope. They could feel the fire's destructive power, but they could also feel its healing power as it warmed their bones. The lodgers seemed to push forward, eager to feel more warmth, and then pull back, afraid of feeling too much. It was important that the lodgers understood fire, so Roz showed them how to build one. She showed the smaller animals how to arrange the kindling, and she showed the bigger animals how to arrange the logs. Bumpkin, Lumpkin, and Rumpkin struck the firestones together, and everyone cheered when they finally managed to spark. As Roz looked around, she saw moles curling up beside an owl, a mouse snuggling between two weasels, hares nestling against a badger. Never before had the robot seen prey and predators so close and peaceful. But how long could the peace possibly last? "I propose a truce," said Roz, "like the dawn truce. Everyone must agree not to hunt or harm one another while in my lodge." "Very well," said Swooper, after consulting his carnivorous friends. "We hunters will control ourselves." "Then it is settled," said Roz. "My home is a safe place for all." One by one, the lodgers each fell into a deep sleep. Even the nocturnal creatures, usually wide awake at that hour, gave in to the coziness of the nest. The robot stood out of the way and quietly tended to the fire as her guests slept through the night. Only when daylight was streaming in through the door did the lodgers finally begin to stir. "You are all welcome to stay here as long as you like," said the robot as the animals rubbed sleep from their eyes. "My home is your home." "Thanks a lot, Roz." Fink carefully stepped over a hare and a woodpecker on his way to the door. "I don't think I would have survived another night on my own. It's just too bad we can't cram a few more creatures in here." And the fox slipped outside. The robot looked down at the fur and feathers that now carpeted the floor. The nest had been completely full that night. If any more animals showed up, they'd be left out in the cold. But Roz was not about to let that happen. Chapter 56. The New Lodges. The second lodge would have to be bigger than the first if it was going to fit Broadfoot the bull moose. He was a towering hulk of an animal and had a thick coat of fur, but even he was struggling with the frigid temperatures. Broadfoot lived on the other side of the pond in a dense section of forest that was home to many animals, most of whom were in desperate need of a good thaw. The winter days were short, so there was no time to waste, and rather than walking all the way around the pond, Roz tested its frozen surface to see if it was safe to cross. She threw a heavy rock high in the air and watched it bounce off the hard ice. Then she carefully walked over the ice and into the forest on the other side, where she found Broadfoot waiting for her. The moose quietly led the robot to the clearing in the trees where the new lodge would go. Then Roz made a fire and watched as cold creatures began crawling out from the shadows. "Do not worry," the robot said to the growing crowd, steam puffing from their noses. "You will all be warm soon, but I need your help." Roz asked the animals to collect anything useful they could find: large stones, strong branches, chunks of frozen mud. With the robot's building expertise and the small army of helpers, construction of the second lodge didn't take long. The animals happily agreed to the robot's truce, and then they shuffled into the warm wooden dome. "If you keep the fire alive, it will keep you alive," explained Roz, as she dropped another log onto the flames. "But be careful. Fire can turn deadly in an instant." At dawn, heavy snow was falling again, and there was Roz, setting out from the nest to build a third lodge. She trudged into the great meadow, where fierce winds had created enormous sweeping snowdrifts. But she powered through and finished the job and was soon beginning work on a fourth lodge, and then a fifth. The island became dotted with lodges that all glowed warmly through those long winter nights. And inside each one, animals laughed and shared stories and cheered their good friend Roz. Chapter 57. The Fire. Strange sounds were echoing from the far side of the pond. What started as a low murmur gradually swelled to a chorus of terrified voices. There was an eerie glow in that part of the forest, and a thick plume of smoke began rising up from the snowy treetops. Roz charged across the ice and found the second lodge completely engulfed by a raging fire. Frightened animals were running in every direction, fleeing for their lives through the deep snow. "What happened?" shouted Roz as Broadfoot galloped wildly past. "We put too many logs on the fire." "In the fire pit," he said without stopping. "The flames climbed up to the ceiling." "My baby is still in there," cried a mother hare, pointing to the burning lodge. "Somebody help, please." Roz didn't hesitate. She plowed through the snow and ducked into the lodge. Flames and smoke were everywhere. A tall stack of logs blazed in the fire pit. and in the far corner a tiny ball of fur was shaking with fear. Crouching low, the robot wound her way beneath the smoke and around the flames and gently scooped up the young hare. Don't worry, or do not worry, Roz yelled over the roar of the fire. You are going to be okay. She turned to leave, but the doorway had started to crumble. So she shielded the hare with her body and smashed right through the walls of the lodge. Sizzling pieces of wood went flying as the robot and the hare burst outside into the soft snow. Oh, darling, you're all right, cried the mother hare, pulling her daughter close. Thank you for saving my baby, Roz. Now that everyone was safely away, the robot turned her attention to putting out the fire. Her glowing eyes darted around as she computed a plan. Then, with all the strength in her legs, Roz launched herself high up into the snowy branches of the nearest pine tree. A moment later, the tree was shaking violently, and heaps of snow were sliding from its branches and pouring onto the flames like an avalanche. Steam hissed up through the smothering mound of snow. The flames quickly died, the snow quickly melted, and within minutes all that remained was the charred foundation of the lodge. Roz dropped down from the tree and waited as the frightened animals slowly returned. Then she said to them, Would you like another lodge? The animals looked at one another, unsure of what to do. Understandably, they were afraid of another fire breaking out, but they were far more afraid of the deadly cold. So they pulled together and worked with Roz and built a bigger, better lodge on top of the old one. It had a taller ceiling and a deeper fire pit. It was made with more rock and less wood, and it had a supply of water for emergencies. But the most important safety feature of this rebuilt lodge were the lodgers themselves, who now had a whole new respect for fire. Chapter 58, The Conversations. Thanks to Roz's truce, life inside the nest was mostly harmonious. But when the animals went outside, it was business as usual. Sometimes a lodger wouldn't return. Sometimes a lodger would return in the belly of another lodger. As you can imagine, that made for some awkward moments. So when everyone was gathered around the fire, they tried to keep things pleasant by having conversations like these. I wonder what Brightbill is doing right now. Chit-Chat lay on her back and looked at the ceiling as she spoke. And where he is and who he's with and if he ever thinks about us back here on the island. I am sure he thinks about us, said Roz. I think about him all the time. I like to imagine that the geese had a fun flight to the wintering grounds, and now Brightbill is floating on a lovely lake, eating yummy food and making wonderful new friends, but hopefully they're not too wonderful, because I'd like to stay his best friend if possible. That is a nice thought, said Roz, but I worry that the flock might have gotten caught in this icy weather. I do not think they would handle it well. Don't worry, I'm sure they're fine, said Chit-Chat. Brightbill is such a great flyer that I just know he'll keep the flock out of trouble. He is a great flyer, said Roz, but I still worry. Life is short. Dig down, the old groundhog was giving another one of his fireside speeches. I'll be lucky if I see the spring. I don't want your pity. I've had a good run. But I'll tell you what. If I could do it all over again, I'd spend more time helping others. All I've ever done is dig tunnels. Some of them were real beauties too, but they're all hidden underground, where they're no good to anyone but me. And they weren't even good to me this winter. Now, the beavers, they have it all figured out. They built that beautiful dam, which created a lovely pond that made all our lives better. That must feel pretty good. The beavers made our lives better in another way, said Fink. They taught Roz how to build. Ain't that the truth, said Digdown. Roz, you must have saved half the island with your lodges.
And to think we used to call you a monster. I'll repay my debt to you if it's the last thing I do." "Your friendship is payment enough," said Roz. "Oh, please, your sweetness is going to make me sick. There must be something we can do." "Your friendship really is enough. Friends help each other, and I will need all the help I can get. My mind is strong, but my body will not last forever. I want to survive as long as possible, and to do that I will need the help of my friends." The animals listened quietly to Roz and thought of their own struggles to survive. Life in the wilderness was hard for everyone. There was no escaping that fact. But the robot had made their lives a little easier, and if ever they could, the animals would return the favor. "I have seen 93 winters, far more than any of you," Crag the turtle spoke slowly, but everyone always listened to his words. "And I can tell you that the winters have gotten colder, and the summers have gotten hotter, and the storms have gotten fiercer." "I heard that the ocean has gotten higher," said Chit Chat, "but I don't see how that could be true. I mean, where would the extra water come from?" "You are right. The ocean is higher," said Crag. "My grandfather used to say long ago this island was not an island at all. It was a mountain surrounded by flatlands. And then the ground shook and the oceans grew and the land slowly flooded until the mountain became this island. Animals from far and wide were forced to come here to escape the floodwaters. In those early days, there were too many animals living in too small a place. The island did not have enough food to feed them all, but between fighting and disease and famine, a balance was finally reached, and we have kept the balance ever since." Chit Chat's eyes grew wide with concern. "If the ocean keeps rising, the island will be swallowed up by the waves, and I don't even know how to swim." "If the waves ever do swallow this island, it will not happen for a very long time," said Crag. "By then we will all be long dead, even me." Everything has a purpose. It was Swooper's turn to lecture the lodgers. "The sun is meant to give light, plants are meant to grow, we owls are meant to hunt. We mice are meant to hide, we raccoons are meant to scavenge. Roz, what are you meant to do?" "I do not believe I have a purpose." "Ha! I respectfully disagree," said Swooper. "Clearly you were meant to build." "I think Roz is meant to grow gardens. Roz is definitely meant to care for Brightbill. Perhaps I am simply meant to help others." Chapter 59. The Spring. Dripping water, flowing water, splashing water. Winter's blanket of snow and ice was finally beginning to melt. White was fading away to expose the grays and browns that had been hidden beneath. Little green buds were appearing all over. Crowds of bright flowers were rising up from the dirt, and soon the island would be bursting with rich scents and colors. At long last, it was spring. The lodgers returned to their own homes. The hibernators emerged from their secret places. Roz roamed across the island and checked in with the beavers and the bears and all the friends she'd missed. Then the robot went home to work in her garden. After the bitterest of winters anyone could recall, life was slowly returning to normal. However, it was a quiet spring. There were fewer insects buzzing, fewer birds singing, fewer rodents rustling. Many creatures had frozen to death over the winter, and as the last of the snow melted away, their corpses were slowly revealed. The wilderness really can be ugly sometimes. But from that ugliness came beauty. You see, those poor dead creatures returned to the earth. Their bodies nourished the soil, and they helped create the most dazzling spring bloom the island had ever known. Chapter 60. The Fish. "Help! Help! He's got my tail!" Paddler was splashing and screaming in the pond. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver were nowhere to be seen, so Roz picked up a fallen tree branch and stomped into the shallows. "Grab onto this," she said as she reached out with the branch. Paddler grabbed it with his big teeth, and the robot lifted him up out of the water. And there, hanging from the young beaver's tail, was Rockmouth, the grumpy old pike. In one quick movement, Roz pulled in the branch and gripped the fish with her 2 hands. Paddler flopped into the water, where his parents suddenly appeared. "What is wrong with you, Rockmouth?" Mrs. Beaver dragged her son away. "You've always been a nuisance, but this time you've gone too far. Do us all a favor, Roz, and toss him to the vultures." "I cannot do that," said the robot, "but I might be able to help." Roz placed Rockmouth in a deep puddle near the pond where he couldn't swim away. Then she waited for the fish to explain himself. Fish aren't very talkative, especially grumpy fish like Rockmouth. But eventually, he opened up to the robot, and before long she was waving for the beavers to join them. "Rockmouth used to live in the river," said Roz as the beavers shuffled over, "but you trapped him here when you built your dam. He has been angry about it ever since." "That doesn't give him the right to attack my son," hollered Mr. Beaver. "It most certainly does not," hollered Mrs. Beaver. "I'd be upset too," said Paddler softly. "I'd hate to be kept away from my home. Mr. Rockmouth, you should have said something sooner." The fish looked up from the puddle with a frustrated expression that meant, "I tried, but no one was listening." Well, the situation had to be remedied, and you can guess who rose to the occasion. Roz was determined to get Rockmouth back to his home. After she explored the nearby waterways, it became clear that she would have to carry the pike through the forest and across the great meadow to the nearest bend in the river. "I need a large container," said Roz to the beavers, "something that I can fill with water so Rockmouth can breathe while I carry him home. I could make it myself, but I thought you might like to help." It couldn't have been easy to overcome her anger with Rockmouth, but after Mrs. Beaver had a chance to cool off, she finally came around. "I suppose we're partly to blame for this situation," she muttered. Then the beavers did the right thing, and together they carved out a wood barrel for the fish. "Here you go." Mrs. Beaver rolled the barrel over to the puddle, where the robot and the fish were waiting. "This should work nicely. Rockmouth, I hope you're happy back in the river." Rockmouth just flicked his tail in a way that meant, "Will someone please take me home now?" Roz filled the barrel with water and a grumpy fish, and then they were off. She carried Rockmouth through the forest and across the meadow until she was standing on the riverbank. "Welcome home," said the robot. Then she tipped the barrel, and the fish plunked into the river. Rockmouth's face poked above the surface. He flashed a big, toothy grin, and then he quickly swam away. Chapter 61, The Robot Stories. The story of how Roz helped Rockmouth spread through the river and across the island, and it was soon followed by other robot stories. There were stories of Roz growing gardens in dry, barren places. There were stories of Roz nursing sick animals back to health. There were stories of Roz creating ropes and wheels and tools for helping her friends. But most of the new stories were about the robot's wildness. You see, Roz had noticed that the wilder she acted, the more the animals liked her. And so she started barking with foxes, and sang with birds, and hissed with snakes. She romped with weasels, she sunbathed with lizards, she leaped with deer. That spring was a very wild time for our robot. Chapter 62, The Return. It was a quiet afternoon on the pond, but the quiet was gradually being overtaken by sounds not heard around there for many months. The sounds grew louder and louder, and then a flock of geese appeared above the trees. Honk, honk, honk. Most flocks of geese move lazily through the sky and trail off in wobbly lines, but not this one. This flock was fast. It flew in a perfect V formation, and it was led by a small, graceful goose. The flock flew once around the pond before gliding down and gently splashing into the water. The geese gathered in a tight group in the middle of the pond. They floated there for a while, softly honking to one another, and then the leader broke away from the others. He swam straight toward the nest, waddled into the garden, and fluttered up to his mother's shoulder. "Welcome home, son," said Roz. "It's good to be back, Ma," said Brightbill. Chapter 63. The Journey. After months of separation, Roz and Brightbill, mother and son, were together again, and they had so much catching up to do. They went into the nest, and the robot built a fire. Then the goose gazed into the flames and told the story of his winter. This is what he said. "We spent the whole first day of our migration flying over the ocean. It seemed like the ocean would go on forever, but just when the flock was getting tired, Longneck pointed to some tiny islands on the horizon. We flew down to one of the islands and ate dune grass and rested our wings. After a few days of hopping from island to island, we reached the mainland and continued over fields and forests, and then the snow began to fall. I'd never seen snow before, and at first I thought it was beautiful, but it just kept coming. The others explained that the snow was early, that we were never supposed to see it, but there it was, piling up around us as we tried to sleep at night. Longneck worried that the weakest geese wouldn't survive, and he was right. We lost old Widefoot to that very first snowstorm. We tried to fly around the snowy weather, but we got completely lost and the weather became even worse. Lakes and ponds and rivers began freezing over. We couldn't find food or water, so we ate snow, and that only made us colder. We had trouble cleaning ourselves, and our feathers became dirty and heavy. The flock was in bad shape, but Longneck kept us moving. "We are geese," he squawked, "and geese keep going." One day we were struggling through a snow shower when we saw something called a farm. It had perfectly square fields and enormous buildings. And stomping her way through the farm was a robot. "She looked like you, Ma." Longneck sent me over to speak to the robot, but I couldn't understand anything she said. So I just followed her through the farm and around a corner, and then I saw something I never expected. Plants. Bright, colorful plants. I didn't understand how plants could live in such cold weather, but then I saw that they were actually inside a building. I learned later that the building was called a greenhouse. It had clear walls made of something called glass. The robot pressed a button on the wall and a door slid open and warm air came rushing out. I hadn't felt warmth in so long that I just had to follow her inside. Ma, it was like summer in there. The air was warm and sweet and sticky, and there were rows and rows of different plants. The robot didn't pay any attention to me, so I wandered around the greenhouse, nibbling on leaves and drinking from puddles. Then I heard a scratchy voice behind me. "If I were younger, I would have killed you by now." I spun around, and there was an old cat. She walked on stiff legs, and her fur was gray and clumpy. The cat's name was Snooks, and she didn't seem very nice. But then she saw the other geese out in the cold with their faces pressed against the glass, and she told me how to open the door. "You can rest here," said Snooks as the flock hurried in. "But stay out of sight. The humans aren't as friendly as me." None of us knew what humans were, but we didn't care. We were just happy to be out of the cold. Loudwing was so happy she cried. The flock drank and ate and bathed and slept and stayed out of the way. Snooks showed us where to leave our droppings so that we wouldn't be noticed, and for a few days the greenhouse was our home. Once or twice a day the robot would go outside and return with a box or a bag, but most of the time she stayed inside and quietly worked on the plants. There was a barn that I just had to explore. It was filled with animals and machines and piles of straw and 2 robots. One robot was fixing a broken door when I walked in. She was using a loud spinning tool called a saw. She pushed the saw through a long piece of wood, and dust shot into the air. Everything was going smoothly until the saw suddenly lurched forward and sliced right through 3 of the robot's fingers. But she was fine. A minute later, there was a thwomp sound, and she popped on a new hand. Then she was right back to using the saw again. The other robot worked with the animals, chickens, sheep, pigs, and cows. They were all in cages. The chickens kept asking how I'd gotten out of my cage. I was explaining that I'd never had a cage when I heard panicked squawks coming from the greenhouse. I ran back and found that a human had discovered the flock. We didn't know what he was saying, but he looked really angry. Longneck tried to defend us. He got in front and spread his wings and honked, but the human wasn't afraid. He pulled out a shiny stick and pointed it right at Longneck. Snooks hissed, "Look out! He's got a rifle!" Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot out from the rifle, and Longneck slumped to the floor. He was dead, Ma. The flock was so scared we fluttered around and honked and knocked over plants, but the human kept moving toward us, pointing his rifle. So I pecked the button to open the door, and we ran outside into the cold and flew away from there as fast as we could. Without Longneck, the flock needed a new leader. Everyone wanted me to lead. I didn't know what to do, so I started by repeating Longneck's words. I squawked, "We are geese, and geese keep going." Then I took the point, and the flock spread out behind me. The weather had us all turned around, and nobody knew which way to go, so I just led us straight south. We saw more robots and humans and buildings, but we didn't stop. We knew we were way off course when we saw the ocean again, but at least it was a little warmer by the water, so I decided to follow the coastline for a while. There were more buildings by the coast. Most of them were on land, but some of them were in the ocean. The ocean buildings were dirty and crumbling and leaning in different directions. There weren't any humans or robots in those buildings, only sea creatures. We saw ships on the water, we saw ships on the land, we even saw ships in the air. They buzzed through the sky like giant dragonflies. And then we reached a place called a city, where thousands of buildings and robots and humans and ships were all close together. When we stopped to rest on a rooftop, we met a friendly pigeon named Graybeak. She had grown up there, so she knew everything about the city. She flew us over towers and under bridges and kept us away from all the buzzing airships. And everywhere we went, there were robots. Some of the city robots were just like you, Ma, but others crawled on 6 legs or rolled down on wheels or slid up and down the sides of buildings. Some robots were really small and some were really big. They moved things and cleaned things and built things and did every kind of job you can think of. Graybeak brought us down a ledge to the side of a building and told us to look through the windows. Inside was a family of humans, and they had a Roz robot. When we looked into other buildings, we saw other humans with other robots. Every human seemed to have a robot. I told Graybeak about you, Ma, and she wanted to show us one last place. We flew out to the edge of the city to a really big building called a factory. Graybeak brought us to the roof windows, and we looked down into the factory and saw machines building sparkling heads and torsos and limbs. The factory was building robots. A machine held up a robot torso and put 2 legs under it, and they snapped into place. It put feet under the legs, and they snapped into place. It snapped arms into the shoulders and snapped hands into the arms. A head was snapped onto the top, and the robot was finished. Ma, the robot looked just like you. I think the factory is where you were built. I wanted to watch more robots being built, but it started snowing again, so we said goodbye to Graybeak and continued flying south. We saw fewer robots and humans and buildings and ships. The air became warmer and the snow disappeared. We started seeing other flocks of geese in the sky, so we followed them to the middle of a wide grassy field where there was a lake and hundreds of other geese. We had finally reached the wintering grounds. After all we'd been through together, our flock had become very close. We kept to ourselves, eating and resting and remembering the geese we'd lost. But after a few weeks, we began to mingle with the other flocks. We met geese from all over the world, and they told us about their homes and their migrations and their troubles with the winter weather. Every flock had lost geese on the way there. A few flocks didn't make it at all. Before we knew it, the early spring flowers were poking up, and it was time to fly home. We followed the usual migration route north. We flew over fields and forests and hills, but we didn't see any signs of humans or robots, and that was fine with us. Eventually, we reached the ocean, and then our island, and then our pond, and then I saw you. Chapter 67. The Sunrise. By dawn, the bonfire had dwindled to a smoldering hill of ash. Everyone else had gone home, and only Roz and Brightbill remained in the meadow. They lay in the grass together, watching as the soft light of morning crept up from the horizon. And then Roz said, "Let us go for a walk." The robot and the goose hiked and flew up to their favorite spot on the grassy ridge. But then they kept going. They followed the ridge to the mountain and climbed all the way up to the craggy peak just in time to see the sunrise. "I climbed up here once before," said Roz, as the sun's first rays warmed her body. "I sat on this very rock, looked out at the island, and thought I would always be alone. But I was wrong. Are you happy, Ma?" The robot thought for a moment. "I am. I'm happy too." Brightbill closed his eyes and felt the wind and the sun. There was a slight chill in the air that made him feel alive. Everything seemed just right. And then he heard a distant buzzing sound. The goose squinted to the south and saw a familiar shape in the sky. He turned to his mother and said, "Ma, there's an airship flying this way." Chapter 68. The Recos. The airship approached from the south, like some giant migratory bird. The ship was a sleek white triangle with a single dark window facing forward. 3 identical robots stared out the window. The robots resembled Roz, but they were bigger and bulkier and shinier. The word Reco was lightly etched into each of their torsos, followed by their individual unit number. They were Reco 1, Reco 2, and Reco 3. The Recos flew in a low circle around the island. They saw a smoking hill of ash. They saw mysterious wooden domes. They saw 4 dead robots scattered across the shore. The airship hovered above the robot gravesite for a moment. Then it floated up over the island and lowered itself onto a small meadow at the foot of the mountain. The engines blasted air toward the ground, bending trees and tearing grass. Then the landing gear sank into the soil, the engines powered down, and all was quiet. A door hummed open, and out stepped the Rekkos. They took several long strides into the meadow and stopped. A shadowy figure was lurking at the forest edge. The Rekkos turned and faced it. They stood flushed together like a sparkling wall. And then the shadowy figure began to move. Out from the trees walked some sort of two-legged creature. It was dusty and dirty. Butterflies flitted around the flowers that sprouted from its body. One of its feet was made of wood. And then the creature spoke. "Hello, my name is Roz." Chapter 69. The Defective Robot. "Hello, Rosum Unit 7134. We are the Rekkos. We are here to retrieve all Rosum units." The cold, flat voice came from Rekko 1. He and his partner stood absolutely still and kept their glowing eyes locked on their target. "There are 4 others," said Roz, "but they are dead." "We have already located the remains of the other units," said Rekko 1. "We will collect them later. Now, come with us." The 3 Rekkos motioned Roz to the airship, but she didn't move. "Where have you come from?" she said. The Rekkos turned and stared at Roz. "Do not ask questions," said Rekko 1. "Where will you take me?" "Do not ask questions." "Why must I leave?" "Do not ask questions." "I will not go anywhere until I get some answers." There was a brief silence as Rekko 1 computed his next move. And then he began to speak. 1 year ago, a cargo ship carrying 500 Rosum units was sunk by a hurricane. 495 units have been retrieved from the ocean floor. We have come here in search of the last 5, and we have located them. Rosum Unit 7134, you are the property of Tech Lab Industries. We will return you to the factory where the makers will refurbish you and sell you to a work site. You will live on that work site indefinitely. Now come with us." "But I live here," said Roz. "That is incorrect. Rosum Unit 7134, any further resistance will be proof of defectiveness, and we will deactivate you." But Roz had more questions. "Who are the makers? What is my purpose? Why can I not ask questions?" "This unit is defective," said Rekko 1 to his partners. "Commence deactivation." In perfect unison, the Rekkos stepped toward Roz. They raised their blocky hands, ready to restrain their target, ready to shut her down with the press of a button, but a loud squawk and a streak of feathers cut them off. "Stay away from my mama!" Brightbill swooped into the meadow and started hopping around, ready to defend his mother. The Rekkos stopped and looked down at the goose. Of course, they didn't understand his words. They heard only meaningless squawks, and then they heard their target squawking back to him. "Brightbill, get out of here," said Roz in the language of the animals. "These robots are dangerous." "What do they want?" "They want to take me away." The Rekkos stared at their target, trying to understand why she was exchanging noises with a goose. And then new noises began rising up. Rustlings and shrieks echoed from the forest. Animals were gathering. Their wild voices called out to one another. "Roz needs our help. Those robots want to take her away. We have to do something." The uproar in the forest grew louder and louder. The Rekkos peered past Roz, towards the mysterious noises, but only saw foliage. Suddenly, shadows swept across the meadow, and Brightbill's flock dove onto the Rekkos. The geese furiously flapped and pecked and wrapped their wings around the robots' faces, clinging to the Rekkos like feathery masks, distracting them, blinding them. Brightbill turned to his mother. "Run." Chapter 70. The Hunt Begins. While his flock distracted the Rekkos, Brightbill darted around behind them and desperately searched for buttons. He had once shut down his own mother with a click, and now he would do the same to these intruders. But he found no buttons on these robots. only smooth surfaces. Clearly, the Rekkos were not designed to be shut down so easily. Giant hands swung through the air, and the geese were swatted away. Loudwing was plunked by her foot and flung to the ground. She crawled to the weeds as the others scrambled up and over the trees. A quick scan by the robots revealed that Roz was gone. The 3 Rekkos turned and marched back to the airship. The door hummed open, and the robots disappeared inside. And when they stepped back into the meadow, each was holding a silver rifle in his hands. The hunt for Roz was on. Without speaking, the Rekkos marched away from one another, fanning out into their standard search pattern. Rekko 1 marched straight towards the southern tip of the island. Rekko 2 marched straight up the mountainside, and Rekko 3 marched straight into the forest. Chapter 71, The Forest Assault. Rekko 3 marched through the forest with steady, stomping strides. His blocky head swiveled from side to side, scanning for any sign of Roz. But he was distracted. You see, everywhere the Rekko went, he was met by shrieking animals. He didn't know it, but he was in the midst of a coordinated assault. Swooper hooted orders from above. Hawks, sparrows, owls, dive in front of his eyes. Fink barked orders from below. Hares, weasels, foxes, dash between his legs. The forest was seething with an army of wild animals, distracting the robot, luring the terrible thing deeper into their trap. Chit-Chat leaped out from the branches and clawed at the robot's eyes, yelling, "Anyone who shows up on our island and tries to take my friend's mother away has a big problem with me." Then she leaped back into the branches. The robot pointed his rifle at the squirrel and pulled the trigger. A blazing beam of light shot through the forest and sent tree limbs crashing to the ground. It grazed poor Chit-Chat, singeing the end of her tail, but she ignored the pain and scurried up to the safety of the canopy. With each stride, the ground grew a little softer, and the robot sank a little deeper, until he was up to his waist in thick, heavy muck. His churning legs slowed to a stop, and he stood there, computing whether to move forward or backward. Rekko 3 was now an easy target. "Begin the bombardment," ordered Swooper. The sky darkened as a swarm of birds descended from the treetops. They swooped past the robot and splattered his face with their droppings. Bird after bird swooped and splattered, and the Rekko's eyes were instantly caked in filth. "Don't let up," screeched the owl. "Give it everything you've got." There seemed to be an endless stream of birds with an endless amount of droppings. Rekko 3 let go of his weapon and wiped his filthy face with both hands. That was the moment the fuzzy bandits had been waiting for. They dashed out from the weeds, snatched the rifle with their nimble hands, and dragged it away. Tawny and Crown Point looked on from the underbrush. The buck lowered his head, and the raccoons carefully placed the rifle upon his antlers. Then the deer and the raccoons slipped into the shadows. By the time Rekko 3 realized his weapon was missing, it was too late. He let out a sad electronic tone, and then, as the birds continued their bombardment, the robot turned and blindly trudged back through the muck. It was now time for the final stage of the plan. Broadfoot, the bull moose, emerged from the trees and stood directly in the path of the blinded robot. Rekko 3 had no idea that his every step brought him closer to the mighty animal. When the robot was in range, Broadfoot turned and kicked back with his powerful hind legs. There was a sharp crack, and dung sprayed from the Rekko's head. The moose kicked again, crack, and the robot's head flopped to one side. A tear in his neck exposed a tangle of silver tubes, but Rekko 3's legs kept pumping. So Broadfoot kept kicking. He pounded the robot's head with his heavy hooves, denting and crushing it into an ugly shape, and with one final crack, the head broke loose, soared through the air, and squelched into the muck. The headless robot fizzled and smoked, his legs ground to a halt, and he never moved again. Chapter 72. The Mountain Rumble. Rekko 2 stood at the mouth of the cave. Razum, Unit 7134, are you in here? The only response was his own flat voice, echoing back. But he sensed movement somewhere down the tunnel, so he switched on his headlights, raised his rifle, and marched inside. The Rekko marched past animal bones and rock piles and wide cracks in the walls. His blocky head swiveled from side to side, scanning for any sign of Roz. But she was nowhere to be found. So he turned and marched back toward daylight, and then a deafening roar filled the cave. From the shadows flew a giant body. Mother Bear charged into the robot and smashed him against a wall. Then Nettle and Thorn jumped in, and together the family went to work. They rammed his legs, they slashed his chest, they muscled him to the ground. On his way down, Rekko 2 squeezed the trigger. There was a flash of blazing light, and the walls began to crumble. Nettle gathered her brother by the scruff and pulled him outside as the avalanche of rock thundered behind them. Mother Bear howled. The rifle exploded. Stones clanged against Rekko 2. The avalanche slowed and settled as a cloud of dust billowed out from the cave. Mother? Nettle peered into the darkness. I'm here, said a weak voice. The young bears dashed inside and found their mother half buried. They pulled heavy stones from her body and dusted her off. I have broken bones, she rasped, but they will heal. Where is the robot? Rekko 2's headlights switched back on. Stones tumbled as the robot staggered to his feet. His body was scratched and scraped. His head was badly dented. His left arm was completely useless. So it was tossed aside. Then the one-armed robot limped out of the cave and continued to hunt for Roz. Don't worry about me, Mother Bear growled to Nettle and Thorn. Kill the robot. With his heavy limp and his grinding gears, Rekko 2 was easy to track. The young bears caught up with him as he was entering a grove of pines, but they didn't attack. Not yet. There was a better place to finish him off, up ahead, so they hung back and followed him across the mountainside. The distant rumble of the waterfall grew louder with each passing minute, and then a slash of white appeared through the trees. Soon the robot was standing beside the roiling, frothing river just above the falls. He was too badly damaged to leap over the falls or to wade through the rapids or to climb down the cliffs, but he had to continue his hunt for the target, so he started limping upriver in search of a safer crossing. There was a rustling, and the young bears exploded out of the trees. They threw their heavy shoulders against the robot's body, and he stumbled sideways into the riverbank. Nettle reared up and wrestled the robot, twisting and shaking him with all of her strength. Rekko 2 felt his feet slipping on the rocks. He felt his body tipping over, and then he plunged into the white water. And he brought Nettle with him. The current immediately swept Nettle toward the falls. She rolled through the rapids, crashed into one rock, and then desperately clambered onto another. Rekko 2 stood straight up, and the river rushed around him. He took a step, slipped, and disappeared beneath the water. But then he was up again. Thorn ran to help his sister, but she was pointing upriver, roaring, "Use the logs!" When the younger bear turned around, he saw what she meant. A jumble of broken logs were wedged between the rocks of the rapids, and a moment later, Thorn was on one of them. With water sloshing over his back, he forced a paw between the logs and pried the top one loose. It splashed into the river and wound its way down through the rapids, only to roll harmlessly past the robot. Then it dropped out of sight. The bear tried again. He popped another log into the river, and this one spun just in time to ram its weight into the robot's chest. Rekko 2 went sailing backwards and sank beneath the surface. When he reappeared, the river was full of heavy wooden torpedoes. One log pounded the robot's shoulder. Another one slammed his face. More logs knocked him closer and closer to the falls. The current became too much for the injured robot, and it carried him away. He grasped for anything solid he could cling to, but the rocks were too slippery. So he settled for a fistful of fur. Nettle had been hanging on to the rock this whole time, but now that the robot was pulling her, she started losing her grip. She couldn't hang on much longer. Finally, she cried out, "I'm sorry, Thorn," and she let go. Nettle and Recco too surged through the tumbling falls. The bear felt the robot release his grip. She watched him glide over the edge, and then she closed her eyes and waited for the end to come. But it was not Nettle's time. Reader, what happened next is hard to believe. You see, the river didn't fall away beneath Nettle. It tightened around her. Hundreds of fish surrounded the bear. They pressed their faces into her fur, they thrashed their tails against the current, and they slowly pushed her away from the edge. Farther and farther they went, gradually moving upriver, until Nettle's brother pulled her from the water. The bears collapsed onto the riverbank, and when they looked down, they saw hundreds of fish looking back up. "Thank you," roared Nettle. "I'll never eat fish again." The fish smiled and sank into the rapids. "I thought you were dead," said Thorn, breathing hard. "So did I," Nettle laughed. "Looks like you're stuck with me for a while longer, little brother." "I'm not little." It felt good to joke, but the bears quickly turned serious. They were both bruised and bleeding, and their mother was in far worse condition. However, it would all be worthwhile if Recco too had finally been killed. The bears crept to the edge of the cliff, and there, at the bottom of the waterfall, strewn across the wet rocks, was the shattered body of a dead robot. Chapter 73. The Chase. Recco 1 was standing in the great meadow. He stared up at the smoking hill of ash and then down at the stampede of footprints around it. There had been a bonfire with hundreds of animals and one robot. But why? The Recco couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. After thoroughly exploring the site, he continued through the meadow and into the forest. It was around that time that he lost communication with Recco 3, then Recco 2, and he knew that his partners had both been destroyed. Recco 1 would have to hunt down the target by himself. The hunter marched on, his blocky head swiveled from side to side, scanning for any sign of Roz. He was soon gazing across the glassy surface of a beaver pond. On the far side, a thread of smoke drifted up from another of those wooden domes. With his powerful legs, the robot launched himself up through the air, soaring in a high, graceful arc over the pond and down to the other side. His heavy feet slammed into the ground, leaving deep craters in the garden by the dome. He hunched over and looked inside, fur and feathers and dying coals of a fire, but the target wasn't in there. The Recco stood perfectly still and watched as the soft rain started dripping down through the tiers of the forest. Then he sensed it. Up in the canopy was something that didn't belong. Roz had been spotted. The hunter watched his target drop from branch to branch, down to the forest floor. Then she bounded away through the thickly tangled underbrush without stirring a leaf, without snapping a twig, and vanished into the green. However, Recco 1 had other means of tracking her. He could sense her electronic signal. The signal was gliding around the edge of the pond, and it was fading fast. A few more seconds and he would lose it entirely. Recco 1 burst into a sprint. The forest seemed to sway and quake from his stomping strides. And a minute later, the forest really did begin to move. Trees were toppling down onto the Recco. He fired his rifle, but 2 toppling trees turned to ash. But then a third swung down through the smoke and hammered his body into the ground. Recco 1 shoved the tree aside, pulled himself up, and continued to hunt. He didn't notice the beavers diving back into the pond. Recco 1 tore through brambles and leaped over boulders, and suddenly the ground was caving beneath him. Down he fell into a deep pit, crashing against the bottom and twisting his leg. The robot violently pounded his leg back into shape. Then he launched himself up and out of the pit. He didn't notice the groundhogs watching from their tunnels. The hunter faced one trap after another. He was pelted with flaming pine cones and tripped by taut vines and crunched by tumbling rocks. The hunter now limped and rattled and was covered in scars, but he kept going. Roz galloped back and forth across the island again and again as she tried to lose Recco 1. But no matter how fast she ran, or how well she hid, or how many animals helped, she couldn't escape the sound of the hunter's stomping footsteps. She had never run so hard for so long, and while her mechanical body was holding up, her wooden foot was not. After hours of relentless pounding, it finally gave out. She was galloping through the rocky forest by the sea cliffs when her foot splintered apart. As soon as Recco 1 found the fresh wooden splinters, he knew his target was in trouble. He stomped out from the trees onto the cliff top and scanned the coastline below. Geese were flying down through the drizzle. Otters were ringing over the rocks. Seaweed and driftwood and broken robot parts were scattered about the shore, but the hunter also sensed a faint electronic signal. Roz was down there, somewhere. The hunter's blocky hand clamped onto the cliff top, and then, it detached. The hand was connected to a strong cable that spooled out from the end of his arm. He gave the cable 2 quick tugs, and then he stepped off the ledge. Recco 1 zipped down the cliffside, one arm releasing the cable, the other clutching his rifle, and he slowed to a gentle stop just as he reached the ground. Then, high above, the robot's hand unclamped and followed the cable all the way down until, thwip, it snapped right back into the end of his arm. Geese squawked and otters squeaked as Recco 1 marched through the robot gravesite. The place was littered with torsos and limbs and heads. They were all valuable parts, but he would collect them later. For now, his only concern was finding Roz. He followed the electronic signal over to a clump of seaweed. But where was his target? Was Recco 1's sensor malfunctioning? The robot tapped his head a few times, but the mysterious signal remained. He looked across for any other signs of her, and as he did, the clump of seaweed reached up and grasped his rifle. Chapter 74, The Clink. 4 robot hands were clamped around the rifle. Recco 1 loomed above. Roz lay below, camouflaged in seaweed. For a moment all was still, and then the hunter suddenly lurched and twisted as he tried to rip the rifle away from his target. But Roz held on. Seaweed fell from her body as she was lifted right off the ground. Her legs dangled in the air until she pounded a foot and stumped against the hunter's broad chest, leaned back, and pulled on the rifle with all her strength. Waves crashed as the robots grappled for the weapon, but Roz was no match for Recco 1. The hunter was too big and too brutal. Roz could feel her body being pulled apart, but she could also feel the rifle being pulled apart. A faint glow appeared between her hands. The glow grew brighter and brighter, and then a blinding explosion launched the robots in opposite directions. When the smoke cleared, shards of the rifle were everywhere. Recco 1's body was pocked with holes, and one arm was charred and crippled. Roz's arms and legs had been blown completely off. She was now just a torso and a head. Inside her computer brain, our robot's survival instincts were blaring. Her battered body simply could not take any more damage. Clearly, Roz was not designed for combat. But the Recco was. He pulled himself to his feet and hobbled toward his target. Roz wanted to get up and run away, but without arms and legs, our robot couldn't move. She could only speak. "Please do not deactivate me," she said. Robot 1 ignored her. His blocky hand reached past her face and touched the back of her head. Click. Chapter 75. The Last Rifle. With the target deactivated, Recco 1 calmly moved on to the next phase of his mission. He limped through the gravesite and began collecting every single robot part. He splashed into the shallows and returned with a foot. He shook the sand from a cracked torso. He pulled a head out from a tide pool. Each part was then piled around Roz's lifeless body. Brightbill watched in horror as his mother slowly disappeared under a pile of parts. Roz looked just like the dead robots, but she wasn't dead. She had simply been shut down. "Don't do it, Brightbill," the flock tried to stop their leader. "It's too dangerous." But the goose was determined to bring his poor mother back to life. Brightbill crouched low to the ground and slowly moved toward the pile of robots. And when Recco 1 limped away to collect another part, Brightbill sprinted over the rocks, pushed past arms and legs, and squeezed into the pile. Click. A muffled voice echoed across the shore. "Hello, I am Rosum, Unit 7134, but you may call me Roz." Brightbill hugged his mother's face as her computer brain rebooted. "Mama, wake up." "What happened?" she said finally. "Where is the Recco?" "He's coming this way." "What were you thinking, Brightbill? You must leave now before he kills us both." "I was scared, Mama," cried the goose. I didn't know what to do." Heavy footsteps stomped toward them. Robot parts were knocked aside, and then Recco 1 looked down at his glowing eyes. With his glowing eyes. Brightbill tried to squirm away, but thick fingers locked around him like a cage. "Mama, help!" cried Brightbill as he was pulled up from the pile. "Please do not hurt my son," begged Roz. "He's harmless." Recco 1 paid no attention to Roz. He just held up the goose in his giant hand, ready to crush the life out of him. Mist swirled in the breeze. Waves sloshed against the rocks. Seagulls circled above. No, not seagulls. Vultures. And one of them clutched something silver in his talons. The vultures spiraled down, and Recco 3's rifle clattered onto the shore. Geese and otters quickly surrounded the rifle. They squawked and squeaked and fumbled with the weapon, trying to aim the clunky thing. The hunter was confused. How had those animals gotten a rifle, and could they possibly know how to fire it? They did know. The geese had seen a trigger pressed before. A beam of light briefly flashed through the gloom. At first it seemed as if nothing had happened, but a moment later, Recco 1's chest began glowing a bright orange, and then it was melting and oozing down its front. And soon there was a wide gaping hole in the middle of his torso. His hand suddenly unclenched, and Brightbill fluttered away. Seawater sprayed over the gravesite, and steam hissed up from the Recco's scorching hot guts. He shook and twitched and collapsed beside Roz. Recco 1 turned his face to Roz and spoke in a quiet, garbled voice. "More Reccos will come for you, and if you destroy them, still more will come. The makers will not rest until all missing robots have been retrieved." When will they come?" said Roz. "How long do we have?" "You can still be fixed, Roz. Go to the airship. Bring all the robot parts with you. The ship knows what to do." His voice went silent. His eyes went dark. Recco 1 was dead. Chapter 76. The Broken Robot. Geese and otters were bustling all around Roz. They were pulling arms and legs out from the robot pile and pressing them against her body. They were hoping to hear thwip sounds and that the robot limbs would snap right into place and Roz would return to her old self and life on the island would go back to normal. But nothing happened. No matter what they did, the limbs wouldn't attach. Our robot's body was too badly damaged. "I'm sorry, Ma," said Bright Bill, his voice trembling. "I thought this would work." "It is okay, son," said Roz calmly. "I am lucky I can still think and speak." The animals tried to smile at their poor friend, but they couldn't hide their sadness. Roz was a mangled wreck, and there was nothing they could do to fix her. The robot wanted to be strong for her son and her friends. She wanted to ease their worried minds and tell them everything would be fine, but Roz knew that everything would not be fine. She looked down at her broken body, then she looked up at the geese and the otters and said, "I will need some help getting home." Chapter 77, The Meeting. Strong, nimble creatures carried Roz up the sea cliffs and across the island. They carefully propped her up inside the nest. They built a fire, and then they left the robot with her son. Roz and Bright Bill sat there, staring at the flames, until the goose finally said, "Do you need anything, Ma?" "I could really use some new arms and legs." The robot chuckled at her own bad joke. "That isn't funny," cried the goose. "My mother is broken, and I don't know what to do about it." "I'm sorry for joking." Roz adjusted her voice to a more serious tone. "I know you want to fix me, but there is nothing anyone here can do." At these words, her son looked away. "Bright Bill, I'm afraid that we have some difficult decisions to make. I think you should arrange a meeting of our closest friends. We could use their advice." The goose disappeared out the door, and soon Roz's oldest and wisest friends were on their way. Loudwing was the first to arrive. She limped into the lodge on her injured foot and sat close to her robot friend. Mr. Beaver appeared next, followed by Fink and Swooper. Then Tawny curled up on the floor. Mother Bear was too badly hurt to make the journey, so Nettle came in her place. She sat in the garden with her enormous head jutting in through the doorway. Bright Bill returned with Chit Chat, who was nursing her burned tail. The last one to crawl in was Crag, the old turtle. Once everyone was there, the meeting began. The group talked all through the night. They discussed the Recos. They discussed what to do about Roz. They discussed how to keep the island safe. There were stark differences of opinion, and tempers flared, but by daybreak the group had agreed to a plan of action. That morning, the dawn truce didn't take place in the great meadow. Instead, it took place in a small meadow by the foot of the mountain in front of the airship. Weary animals quietly hobbled into the clearing. The only sounds came from a gurgling brook that wound through the gathering and right past our robot. Roz sat in the wet grass. She was leaning against a rock. She looked so sad and frail. However, she still had her thoughts and her words, and for the moment that was all she needed. "Good morning, animals of the island." Roz's voice filled the meadow. "I must look strange to you, all beaten up like this, but I hope I still sound like your old friend." Hundreds of heads nodded. "You fought bravely yesterday. You risked your lives defending me, and I am eternally grateful. But many of our friends were wounded. Some may not recover. And there is worse news. Before the last Reco died, he told me that more of his kind will come to our island. They might already be on the move. And even if we defeat them, still more will come. My makers will not rest until all of their property has been retrieved. They want the dead robots. They want the broken parts. They want me." The crowd was silent. "But I care about this island far too much to put any more lives in danger. And so, my friends, I must leave. Voices cried out, "Don't go, Roz. Next time we'll be prepared. We'll risk our lives so you could stay." "I hear you." The robot's voice cut through the din. "But look at me. My body is ruined, and the Recco said the only ones who can help me are my makers." "What if he lied?" howled a voice. "You can't trust those monsters." "You are right," said Roz. "He might have been lying. There may be no hope for me, but that is a chance I have to take. Animals, you taught me to be wild. I want to be wild again, and so I must try to get the repairs I need. It is for the good of me and the island that I return to my makers." A calm settled over the crowd. They knew Roz was right. Chapter 78. The Farewell. Our robot had an army of animals at her command, and she asked them to bring every robot part and rifle back to the airship. Absolutely everything had to go. It was the only way to be sure that the Reccos would never come back. The island animals had no trouble locating the remains of the dead robots. Retrieving those remains took a bit of more effort, but they were up to the challenge. Teams of clever creatures returned with robot parts of different shapes and sizes. Smashed heads and broken rifles and twisted tubes and heavy bodies were all loaded into the ship until the entire island had been cleared. Even the tiniest scraps were collected. It's amazing what an army of animals can do. A light mist was falling when they finally heaved Roz through the ship's doorway. Her head slowly turned around to face the crowd of geese and beavers and owls and insects and foxes and raccoons and vultures and moose and bears and possum and fish and deer and otters and turtles and woodpeckers and squirrels and frogs and hares and on and on. Every animal on the island had come to give the robot a proper send-off. "Goodbye, you wild animals," Roz's voice echoed through the gray mist. The wild animals smiled, and then a few of them started to roar, and then more started to screech, and then more started to howl and chirp and grunt. Soon every creature was hollering goodbye to Roz. The chorus of wild voices grew louder and louder, shaking the robot's body, rattling the ship, booming across the island and up into the clouds, and then their voices gradually died down to silence. Brightbill fluttered up to his mother's shoulder. "You understand why I must leave," said the robot. "I understand," sniffled the goose. "More Reccos could be headed here right now. I just do not know. There is so much I do not know. I think it is time I get some answers." "Will I ever see you again?" said Brightbill, wiping his eyes. "You are my son, and this is my home," said Roz. "I will do everything in my power to return." Brightbill hugged his mother's worn face. "I love you, Mama. I love you, son." The goose fluttered back to his flock. The robot took one last look at her home. The door hummed closed. Chapter 79. The Departure. The airship's engines automatically fired up. Then the ship slowly floated above the island, turned to the south, and disappeared into the clouds. Chapter 80. The Sky. Our story ends in the sky, where a robot was being whisked away from the only home she had ever known. As Roz sat in the airship, broken and alone and speeding toward a mysterious future, she looked back at her miraculous past. Reader, it must seem impossible that our robot could have changed so much. Maybe the Reccos were right. Maybe Roz really was defective, and some glitch in her programming had caused her to accidentally become a wild robot. Or maybe Roz was designed to think and learn and change. She had simply done those things better than anyone could have imagined.
However it happened, Roz felt lucky to have lived such an amazing life. And every moment had been recorded in her computer brain. Even her earliest memories were perfectly clear. She could still see the sun shining through the gash in her crate. She could still hear the waves crashing against the shore. And she could still smell the salt water and the pine trees. Would she ever see and hear and smell those things again? Would she ever again climb a mountain? Or build a lodge, or play with a goose? Not just a goose, a son. Brightbill had been Roz's son from the moment she picked up his egg. She had saved him from certain death, and then he had saved her. He was the reason Roz had lived so well for so long. And if she wanted to continue living, if she wanted to be wild again, she needed to be with her family and her friends on her island. So as Roz raced through the sky, she began computing a plan. She would get the repairs she needed. She would escape from her new life. She would find her way back home. The end.